Zion, dear Zion, land of the free.
So today we want to talk about solutions, education solutions. Most of you you're probably here because you already understand the problems that we're facing. Is anyone not here because of that? You guys already know, everyone knows what Common Core is. Everyone knows about government overreach in our education. So we're not here to talk about problems or, an expose on the horrible things going on in the world. We're here to talk about solutions. So a brief disclaimer. We come from the LDS perspective. We are LDS. We can't help but talk LDS in just about everything we say. So are most people here LDS? So we're kind of talking the same lingo. If you're not, okay, the reason I mention that, so that if you're not, and we're sitting here talking about LDS quotes or something, the principles still apply to everyone. And if you read the 5,000 Year Leap, this was the book on the Founding Fathers and free government, and their take on religion was that all religion, there was a minimum standard of religion that if you just met these few things, you were capable of freedom and self-government, and you were compatible with all the philosophies of America, right? So if you have read this book, you've seen these: a belief in a creator, a belief that the creator has revealed a moral code for happy living, which tells us right and wrong, a belief that the creator holds mankind responsible for their choices, and that there is an afterlife where we're judged for our actions. If your religion, whatever it is, generically believes those things, then you are capable of living in a society of self-government where you do not have masters rule over you. That was kind of their foundation. So if someone's not LDS, but you're like, oh yeah, those click with me, then everything we're going to talk about tonight still matches you perfectly, but we're going to speak from our own perspective because that's just how we know how to speak. I'm going to turn the time over to Ben, and he's going to talk about how we got here. So briefly, we're going to talk about the history of Utah. This is some specific history to Utah that people have not heard before. So we'll turn that time over to him. Ben?
Appreciate everybody being here tonight and being able to, I know it's a Friday night, there's lots of other things that we could be doing, but I think this is important, and the information that we're going to share with you is going to be something that I think you'll find very interesting and something you've actually not heard before. I know a lot of times we come to these meetings and we're like, oh, I've heard that maybe 100 times before. Well, tonight I hope that these are things that are new to you, and not only new to you as just information, but new to you in a way of these are things that that have given me information of what I can do about what's going on. And to understand the solution, we have to understand how we got to where we're at. Right? We find ourselves lost. We don't know how we got here, and so we don't know how to fix things. And so it's important sometimes to retrace our steps and to find a map to be able to find our way back to correct principles. And education is an essential tool for us, and not only for our children, but for ourselves to understand how we can better be effective in all parts of our lives. In fact, people for good and for evil understand the benefits of education. This man right here, Joseph Stalin, he understood education, the importance of it. He says that education is a weapon whose effect depends on who holds it in his hands and at whom it is armed. Understanding it's a tool, kind of like the internet's a tool for good or for evil. It's a neutral thing that can be used one way or another. This guy right here, John Dewey, father of modern education, he understood education, the importance of education as well. He understood it from a certain perspective. He said there is no God and there is no soul. There is no room for fixed and natural law or permanent moral absolutes. He's considered the father of modern education, and what much of our schooling system, our government schooling system, is based upon his teachings. And this is his perspective. And he taught this principle. He says that if the public schools can keep children occupied from 7 or 7:30 in the morning throughout the day with sports or music or drama, after school and homework in the evening, the parents will have less than an hour a day with their children. And the family's church and influence over them could be broken in about a generation. So he understood the importance of education in his agenda and what he wanted to do. In fact, another man, a famous author by the name of George Orwell, explained not only education, but the importance of history in education. He said that the most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. Now, hopefully this is something that's clear, but I want to go through some examples of how this is done. Sometimes we think that we've escaped the government school system because we have our children at home, but we're using some of the government's books, history books for curriculum. And this is a book that's commonly used today in the K-12 education, online education system. And this is a history book, and when you go through it, it commonly uses different opinion phrases as facts. And it makes statements such as, John Adams was passable as president. Now, just as somebody that reveres the Founding Fathers, that's offensive just on its face. But as somebody that's trying to learn history, that's not an historical statement. That's just a statement of opinion by the author of the book. As opposed to teaching a student history, they're propagandizing a student in what a good president is, as opposed to teaching them how to think. They're teaching them what to think. From the book it says, John Adams thought the aristocratic should govern. He did not trust the mass of the people. So again, it's trying to put John Adams as somebody that just wanted the elites to rule. Another statement the book says, just imagine if each state had the right to declare laws unconstitutional. Things would get very strange. Now, it was going through some background on this quote. It was talking about the Virginia resolutions by Thomas Jefferson, who said that the states were a part of this contract between the states and the federal government. And the states had every right, you can imagine a contract between two parties where only one party was allowed to decide what the contract meant. It wouldn't be a very fair contract. So Thomas Jefferson, understanding the Constitution because of who he was, understood that both sides needed to have a voice in what the contract meant. And he taught a principle that is explained in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, that states had the authority to be an enforcing arm of the Constitution. And so the book was going through and undermining that aspect as well. Another thing that this book teaches students is that Mayberry versus Madison gave the Supreme Court the power to decide if a law passed by Congress meets the requirements of the Constitution. So they're saying that the book is explaining that before this, this ruling by the Supreme Court gave themselves more power. Now, if we understand the Constitution at all, we understand that the Supreme Court can't grant itself more power. That's unconstitutional. And so we're trying to, so it's attempting to teach the students that the Supreme Court can give itself more power, and it's not limited by the Constitution like the other branches of government. So these are some of the attacks that are happening right now to history and to education with our students. Another example is the attacks on Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers. This book right here by Fawn Brody. This book right here is The Origins of the Slander Against Thomas Jefferson, claiming that he was a philanderer and that he fathered illegitimate children through his slaves. And what's interesting is that this book claims to be history, and you see a lot of histories on television, and that it's just common knowledge, supposedly, that this is what Thomas Jefferson did was true. But what we don't know is that, in fact, its origins are very dubious. There's a man by the name of James Callender, who was a newspaper guy that thought he helped Thomas Jefferson to get to the position that he was in and was expecting a position in Thomas Jefferson's cabinet. And Thomas Jefferson didn't appoint him in that position, and so he used his newspaper to slander Thomas Jefferson, and those slanders have stuck to this day. And in fact, recently they did DNA tests to try and see if it was true or not, and they've all proven that he did not father illegitimate children through his slaves. But these things continue on as supposed facts. So restoring the truth. Even though these things are becoming or have become commonplace in some circles, there are a lot of good people that have come up with different books and different materials to help us learn the truth about the Founding Fathers, debunk some of the lies, and establish and go back to the original documents explaining the really inspired foundation that our nation has. And I want to go through just a few of those examples of some of the inspired stories of our founding that aren't really known to us in general. Here's an example. In 1746, there was a French admiral. He sailed his fleet for New England with 70 ships and 13,000 troops. And he intended to capture Louisburg, Nova Scotia, and destroy Boston, and destroy the area from Boston to New York. And so the governor of Massachusetts called for a day of fasting and prayer. A little bit different than today when they do that. It wasn't just for political expediency. They were truly seeking the guidance and the protection of their Father in heaven. And in the prayer, he says, "Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the water. Scatter the ships of our tormentors." And shortly thereafter, the sky starts to be filled with clouds, and a giant hurricane hits and destroys many of the ships and forces the captain is humiliated. He throws himself upon the sword. A great miracle happened in that case. Another miracle of the Founding Father era that has been taken out of our schools is the bulletproof George Washington. Thankfully, because a lot of the books that are coming out nowadays, more people understand about this. But during the French and Indian War, George Washington was targeted as a leader, as a general, by the Indians, and they said, "You need to go after that man." And as they went after him, they missed every time. And so the Indian chief said, "Hold back. He has the protection of the Great Spirit." And afterward, George Washington said, "But by the all-powerful dispensation of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." Everyone was dying before him. His horses were being killed. He had holes through his jacket, which would normally have killed him. But because of divine providence, he was protected. Another example is from Thomas Jefferson. Education system today likes to tell us that he was a deist or an atheist and was anti-Christian. But it's not true. He called for a day of fasting and prayer as we prepared for the signing of the Declaration of Independence, because the delegates at the time weren't sure. And so he said that the effect of the day through the whole colony was like a shock of electricity, and it moved the delegates to sign the Declaration of Independence. Now we understand that our founding we have inspired foundations, and that we are guided and directed. Even though that the media and the schools have tried to undermine that fact, we have materials that are coming out with that to understand that. But something else that's being done, not only is there an attack on the foundations of our country, there's an attack on the foundations of our state, of the state of Utah. We also have inspired foundations that are being removed. I want to go over some of those tonight. Joseph F. Smith said, "It was the will of the Lord, made known shortly after the organization of the church, that steps should be taken to have the children of the members taught in schools, conducted under the influence of those who had faith in the gospel." Education importance is very important. So just because we are explaining the issues and the difficulties that we all see with the government education system doesn't mean we're anti-education. Education is vital. That's very important. But it has to come from the proper foundations. John Taylor explained that Latter-day Saints, he says, "Will you send your children to be taught of people who would teach them enmity to their fathers and mothers, and who would sow in their young hearts the seed of enmity, to the principle of religious liberty, men who, if they had the power, would destroy the altars of freedom that the fathers of this country fought for. He's explaining to the parents of students the importance of making sure that not only is education important, but the people and the education itself is just as important as learning. John, and the principle not only is an important principle to be taught by people that would promote the principles of liberty and promote the gospel, but there are other principles that are underlining the education system. Brigham Young explained, he says, "I am opposed to free education as much as I am opposed to taking away property from one man and giving it to another who knows not how to take care of it." Would I encourage free schools by taxation? No. And so at this time, during the early days of the Utah Territory, the federal government came in and deposed the legally elected officials of the state, like Brigham Young as governor, and imposed their own puppets. A man like Alfred Cumming here. And he spoke to the legislature about education. And he had a different perspective than what those other people that I just quoted from. Speaking to the legislature, he said, "In this city and throughout the territory, many large and spacious schoolhouses have been built, and the sight of hundreds of children who daily attend them is very cheering." Kind of buttering up, saying, you guys have really good schools here. He says, "But as yet you have no free or common schools, and I would again impress upon you the vital importance of appropriating a portion of the territorial revenue to the establishment and maintenance of such schools." And so just going against the culture of the time, he was trying to influence the legislature to go against what Brigham Young had said and start to use tax dollars to fund government schools. And this was not just the governor of the territory. Other people understood what Stalin had said, that education could be a tool. In a conference of the Presbyterian Church in the 1800s, in 1881, they reported that their schools in Utah are schools unsettle the faith of the children of Mormonism. These schools develop into churches as a rule. The schools are the entering wedge to split parental opposition through the children. There was a lot of different competition during this time in the state for the education of our youth. And they understood that it could be used as that weapon to be able to divide, depending on who holds that weapon. And along those same lines, this Catholic preacher, he said that in Utah especially, schools were the backbone of our missionary work. Adults were fanatics and so far beyond the reach of our influence, but the plastic minds and wills of the young we could hope to win. They knew that they could use the schools to be able to shape the minds of the youth in the direction that they wanted to go. This wasn't just through those means either, but there was another attack on the foundations of our education. There was a law passed called the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887. And through it abolished the elected office of the superintendent of schools. And so it took away the ability of members of the church, the dominant population, to be able to have people in charge of the education system that represented their values. Additionally, the law also prohibited the use of any books of a sectarian nature. So a lot of us remember that, well, not remember, but know about in the 1960s about trying to take prayer out of schools, Supreme Court rulings. Well, this law was kind of the beginning of that movement to take religion out of schools by taking religious texts out of the schools in the territory. So this is this is also another history book that's used in the state of Utah. And I want to compare and contrast some of the statements that are made in it and comparing it to the actual historical documents. It's very important to not just go after opinion, but to actually look at what was said and done. So one of the claims of this Utah history book that's used in our state is that the Mormons believed in majority rule, trying to indoctrinate students into believing that we believed in mob rule, or that the idea that two wolves and a sheep can decide what's for dinner, as Benjamin Franklin put it. Well, this is not exactly accurate. We look at the teachings of the leaders of the church at the time. There's John Taylor. He says, we talk sometimes about vox populi, vox dei, The voice of the people is the voice of God, yet sometimes it is the voice of the devil, which would be more proper vox populi, vox diaboli. The voice of the people is frequently the voice of the devil. The people here in Utah understood what the founding fathers understood, that we had a republican form of government that would protect everyone's rights. It didn't matter if half of the room plus one voted to take away your family. You didn't have the right to do that just because you were a majority. They understood that the importance of protecting the rights of the minority. Another claim in this Utah history book is that Protestants thought that one way to solve the Mormon problem was to give a broad schooling to the children. They set up many good schools. This probably gave the best schooling available. So they're claiming that the Protestants had the best schools in the territory. That's opinion claim. Wouldn't be a factual claim, but kind of looking back of what the desires of the Protestants of the time were. This is what they were saying that they wanted to do, was to divide through the schools the parents from the children. Now we want to restore the truth. Now a lot of things that we've done and that we're developing here is an understanding, looking at history from as many perspectives as possible. We don't want to replace a biased education system with another biased education system. I mean, I guess everybody's got a bias, but we want to be able to paint a complete picture for the learner. You can just imagine, everybody views an event from a different angle. Even if you see an accident, and an officer will ask all the witnesses, and each witness will give a different account of what happened leading up to that accident. With you as an audience. Myself will can describe you differently than somebody sitting in the back of the room. I won't be able to tell you what the back of your shirt looks like, and they won't be able to tell you what's on the front of your shirt. And so it's important to have through history, getting as many perspectives, not perspectives, but views as possible of the same events, and so that we can come to our own conclusions. We can actually learn how to think and not what to think. And so through what we've developed, I want to give you some examples. Going through the original histories of the territory, there was a group called the Utah Loyal League. And the purpose of this Loyal League was to eradicate by peaceable means the doctrine of the Mormons. Okay, this is what their purpose was. That they were to combine in opposition to the political rule of the so-called Mormon Church. Okay, that's just what it was. It was a group of elected officials and judges and different kind of just leading people in the community. This was their goal through this organization. Now, 99% of the histories of today don't mention this organization at all. Who's heard of the Utah Loyal League before tonight? That has never seen my presentation. So nobody's ever heard of the Utah Loyal League, right? But this was a common occurrence. And if you go to the histories, the official histories, several of them during the 1800s, it was all throughout because they were a major part of the development of the Utah territory because of who was involved. But we look at this history book right here, written by the Utah State University. Its one mention of the Loyal League says that it was a youth club, and it was hoped would bind the youth to Protestantism. Now, comparing the original history and the original explanation of this group to this current one, we can see that a complete picture or an honest picture is not being painted here. And these might be shocking to us. And, we have these books that help really correct and set the story straight for American history. There's been nothing yet to this time that has done the same thing for Utah history until now. This is something that we've developed and that we're developing now that will come out soon, is a Utah's inspired history, which we're working to prepare a new generation of leaders. And we want to restore a love of learning. History itself, I know for some people, they just hate history. I love looking at history, but I remember when I was in school, history was boring. It was just a bunch of names and dates, and it didn't mean a whole lot to me. how can we make history exciting, where people want to get together and learn more about what actually happened? Because the importance of, why do we want to learn history? Why is learning? I'll ask one question. Why do you think learning history might be important? So we don't repeat. We can learn from the mistakes of others without having to do it ourselves. We can watch somebody burn themselves on the oven and say, I don't want to do that. Right? You know, I want to give some examples of names and dates. There are times, you know, that names and dates are important to give us context of history. It's important to understand who did something and when they did it so we can say what's going on around us. But if you look at histories, BYU did an article called John the Revelator, talking about not John the Revelator from the New Testament, but John Taylor from the early days of Utah, because he had so many revelations. And so if you just said, John Taylor had a revelation in 1883 and then went on to something else, you know, that's a name and a date that doesn't mean anything. But if we had the context of what was going on around, what was happening, what was the question that led to that in that revelation in 1883? What happened afterwards? What did it tell them? What did they learn from it? These are things that can make history interesting and exciting for us to want to learn more about. You know, and so even though you might not have focused on the name and the date, just more than just knowing who did it, because that part is important, but we instilled a love of learning by telling them the exciting things that happen along with it. Now I want to go over a couple of more things. These are just kind of examples of different official histories from the 1800s. Official state and other histories that were published during the 1870s, 1880s. And it was talking about another secret society of the time. And the idea of talking about secret societies was very common at the time. It wasn't taboo. And it taught about a secret society called the Gentile League of Utah. Anybody heard of the Gentile League of Utah? A few of you? So it's the secret society known as the Gentile League was formed with its program, the deliberate massacre of municipal officers and citizens. Okay, this is just recording of the history of, and that's an interesting thing. Okay, an organization that had this program to do that. You know, there's a lot of different radical groups out there, but we need to understand who was in this organization. Those kind of the names and the dates that kind of help us sometimes. And this lists some of the names. You got Robert Baskin, the Reverend. So this guy was a mayor as well as other positions. You had a judge. The judge, William Hayden, was a member and a leader of this organization, and he said that if the populace interrupted their program, the streets of Salt Lake would be running down with blood. Now, that's a pretty radical statement that if somebody were to say that today, would be all over the news. And this was what the leaders, the Gentile leaders of the territory at the time were talking about and were guiding things in the state. But if you go to 99% of the current histories, you won't find any mention of this major organization. In fact, if you look at, it wasn't just a small group either. There was, in the state that was much smaller than it is today, of course, they had over 4,000 members. Not just 4,000 random people, but 4,000, a majority of them being prominent people in the community, elected officials, again, judges, things like that. But most of us have never heard of this organization and its influence on our state. Now that could be pretty interesting. I know, talking to my 12-year-old, you talk about somebody threatening blood in the street. That gets him pretty excited for history. Now, restoring the truth. We've all heard about the miracle of the seagulls. Now, this miracle of the seagulls, where they had a problem with the Mormon crickets, and all of a sudden, at just the right time, these seagulls came in and ate the crickets and saved the farmers. But this has been removed from all of the education, all the schools, all the histories that are published today. And in fact, they are turning it into a myth. They're saying that it never actually happened in many cases. But besides, there was another miracle that wasn't in Mormon, that wasn't the crickets. There was a miracle of the grasshoppers. This probably isn't a history that many of you have heard about. But during the summer of 1854, grasshoppers were threatening to destroy the crops of the settlers in the Kaysville area. And there was at the time to save them, a huge canyon wind came through and wiped out all the grasshoppers and saved their fields. And that's the last time, 1854, that something like that had been recorded of happening. That's a miracle. And that's not something that we hear a lot about. Another example of the miracles. During the time, you got a guy hiding here in the closet, right? You had the leaders of the church in the 1800s were on the run from the government. And John Taylor, president of the church at the time, in the 1880s, he was hiding out in somebody's home. And they had a little room hidden up for him, and a federal officer found out that he was held up there. And they go looking through the house, trying to find him. And he's hiding, John Taylor's hiding in the closet, and all of a sudden, this federal official pulls open the closet and separates the clothing, looks right in John Taylor's face, closes the clothes and says, "He's not here." Didn't see him. It's a miracle that happened. And miracles don't just happen in important, so-called important people's lives, leaders' lives, people with big stewardships. They happen in everybody's life, and we can't include every history. We can't include every miracle, but I think it's important to include miracles of everyday people, because when our students are trying to learn their purpose in life, what they're inspired to do and what they're called to do, they need to know that the Lord will inspire them. So I want to tell a story about an ordinary man. He was one of the bodyguards for the leaders of the church, and he was plowing his field one day, and he was called off to some important church work to do. And he said, I don't have any time to take care of this, but I need to take care of this. I need to take care of this work that God has called me to do. And when he came back, his field had been plowed. He went around to his neighbors, and they said, "I wasn't here. I didn't do it." His family said, "We didn't see who did it. It was just miraculously done." Another time, he was harvesting his field, and he was called off again, and he returned. The same thing had happened. His entire field had been shucked for him, and these miracles that happen in everyday people's lives can happen in our lives, and our students need to know that they can be inspired in the direction of their life. And so we've developed a Utah's Inspired History, because we know that we can do better. There are histories out there just like that are correcting the falsehoods of America's founding. We need to set the record straight of Utah's founding and Utah's history, even to this day. How did we get here to where we are today, and how can we fix things? And so we've developed this through working with, Dr. Scott Bradley, working with him and other PhDs to make sure that we're on the up and up. We've done, this is not just through Google searches. We've gotten original documents and done hours and hours of research through the special collections of the University of Utah, of BYU, of the Church History Library, and of course the state's official history department, to be able to develop. We're developing a Utah history curriculum to be able to help parents and students to be able to understand the truth and how that we can lead ourselves into a better future. And so we'd like to invite you to pre-order a copy that should be available in early 2017. We have order forms in the back, and I've got some here. You can grab one and pass it around. Give you a discount to help us support us in getting this off the ground, but it'll be available soon. We're in the middle of writing it and the development with this. And it's going to have not just a history book for reading, but it'll be a book that provides resources, provides materials, provides activities and suggestions of ways to be able to dig deeper. Give an idea. Here's something that happened. Here's a way to go dig more into it. Because if we were to cover every single bit of Utah history, this would be 20-something volumes. And so this is just a tool to get you and your student excited about history again.